dynamics. Today we're going to talk about this. Population, again, is a group of one species in an area at one time. And so you could think about the group, how many humans are in a room, or how many apple trees there are in an orchard, or how many wolves there are in a certain park in Africa, or something like that. So a population is how many of that species there are. It's a whole, how many, of that one species. And the population dynamics is how those populations, one population is affected by other factors, other things around it. And so we went outside today, we played Oh Deer. You don't have to know how to play Oh Deer to understand what happened, or this data here. So the population, if this isn't the x-axis and the y-axis, the population of deer went up and it went down and it went up and it went down and went up. And when we graph that, we see something similar to this, and sometimes it kind of levels out right here on this dotted line. Now, what is this dotted line? This dotted line is what we call the carrying capacity. So if I were to give you 100 pounds, and 100 pounds is all that you could lift. If I were to give you 100 pounds, then you could hold it. If I were to give you 105 pounds, you probably will not drop it straight to the ground. But what will likely happen is, as I add pound after pound after pound, you'll slowly start moving down. Now, if I were to add 20 pounds, you'd probably drop it pretty quickly. If I were to add 100 more pounds, then you would drop it extremely quickly. So what happens here, this carrying capacity is telling us how many of this species the area can hold. So in this case it was deer. How many deer can be supported in the area that we were playing the game? So the population rose, and then something happened. It hit almost like, it seems like something hit something that you couldn't see, and then it came back down, and then it went back up. And this little dotted line shows us this is how many deer that area can hold. Well, what happens is you can actually overshoot it and go above, and then what tends to happen is it drops down below that carrying capacity. It goes back and forth, and eventually, once it becomes stable, it'll actually have a line right above or right below. The population will just kind of creep up a little bit above it or go a little bit below it, but it won't be drastic like you see in the beginning. That is the carrying capacity, and that's determined by certain limiting factors. How many organisms of one species an area can hold is determined by the limiting factors in that area. So if I were to have 100 acres and I wanted to raise deer, then I could just let them live naturally, maybe plant plants like trees and stuff out there and just kind of let them live naturally on the 100 acres. Or I could plant certain plants that they like every year, like corn, or I could put corn out on feeders. I could put salt blocks out. I could put a bunch of things out, but all of those things are trying to increase this little line, this carrying capacity. So if I give them a lot of food, then maybe they can reproduce more, and that increases their carrying capacity. But population dynamics, one aspect of it that we're going to talk about is it's affected by limiting factors. So let's talk about density dependent and density independent limiting factors. Density dependent means that the population number, how many there are in that area, their density, how many there are depends on, their population depends on how many there are. So if there's a lot of organisms in an area, let's say that have those deer, if there are a lot of deer out there, then there's a higher chance that they would get a certain disease, and that disease would hurt them negatively. It would affect them negatively. If there was a lot of them, then competition would be more. So they have a certain amount of food, and they're all sharing that food. There's some competition for food. In their case, acorns and grass and corn or whatever it is that I've got out there for them. And also, predation. The more there are, the higher chance of one of them dying from a predator. So these are dependent on how many there are out there. The opposite of that would be an density independent. If the limiting factor, let's say a hurricane, when a hurricane came through Valdosta, the hurricane was not drawn towards Valdosta because of how many pine trees there were. If there were less pine trees or more pine trees, it would not have affected how many or whether the disaster happened. So density independent means There are some limiting factors that have nothing to do with how many of that species there are in the area. So for density dependent, the higher the population, the more at risk they are. For density independent, it has nothing to do with how their population number. It just has to do with other events outside of them. So those are two groups of limiting factors. So for the deer, that may be their water, how much water they have, how many wolves there are nearby or coyotes, how many people hunt that area, what kind of resources they have as far as minerals or energy. That's all dependent. How easily disease comes in, all those are limiting factors. All right, let's talk about population distribution. So when you look at organisms in nature, they tend to follow one of these examples. They're uniformed, where they're nice and evenly spaced. They're clumped together. I think of Africa's Serengeti or the savanna, where it's mostly grass in between, but the trees are clumped in groups. You'll see mostly grass, but in areas there'll be 4, 5, or 10 trees. 4, 5, or 10 trees, more trees elsewhere. Or we have random, where some of them are grouped close together, and then there's big open spaces. That's going to be random. So I think of dandelions. If you've driven by somebody's property or their yard and they have dandelions in their yard, they're probably random. For uniform, it's kind of a man-made situation, but one you've probably seen is pine trees. As you're driving down pine trees, if they've been planted, they're going to be uniformly spread out. All right, so that's population distribution. That's how the organisms in that area of that one species, how they're spread out, how they're distributed out. Population distribution. And then last, we've got two types of growth that we'll see. So one type of growth is exponential, and this is ideal if there is an unlimited amount of food and water and all the other things, then they can have exponential growth, which essentially starts out kind of slow, doubling, or is growing exponential to where at one point it goes almost straight up. This is not realistic. This is only under ideal conditions. It's called exponential growth, and the curve looks like this. Logistic growth looks like this. It may start out exponential, but eventually it's going to go up and down, and it's going to kind of end up being what we talked about up here for carrying capacity. It's going to end up being somewhat even on there. So it's contrasted with exponential growth that just continues going more and more, faster and faster. Logistic growth is more realistic. This is what happens in nature.